In this video, I sat down with Brian Atwood. He is the CEO of Sindarin and one of the most decorated minds in voice AI. In this video, expect to learn what his favorite models are for voice AI agents, how he built Sindarin and what he does to make Sindarin the best voice AI platform out there, and his opinion on the OpenAI real-time API. So for those who don't know, who is Brian Atwood?
I am a career-long software engineer slash kind of product person. Prior to that, I was a PhD dropout in cognitive science and neuroscience with a little bit of dabbling in computational neuroscience, which is sort of how I got into AI, I guess, originally. And I'm also a lifelong curmudgeon about apps, despite having spent most of my professional career building them. I never particularly liked using apps. I was never an early adopter. If anything, I was always a very late adopter of new apps. And so, I think that frictionless interfaces are kind of ultimate sort of concern and value. And so I think for that reason, that's how I ended up working in voice AI.
And since you say you work in voice AI, just for the people to understand, because obviously, it's a pretty new topic and a new market, I would say. So what does your day-to-day look like in terms of voice AI? How is it maybe not differ, but just because obviously you're doing much more high-level stuff, which I want to obviously convey. So what does your day-to-day look like in terms of voice AI?
Sure. My day-to-day is a lot of writing code. It's also a lot of speaking with customers and the rest of our team to onboard customers, to move them through the pipeline, to give them additional support. So I guess it's probably, the number one thing that I spend time doing is writing code. Number two is speaking with either existing or potential customers. Number three is kind of speaking with the team, hopefully doing a good job leading the team, and then sort of ... a little bit, when I have time, kind of keeping up with what's going on in sort of the research world. So reading papers, doing some amount of implementation of things that we think are interesting or potentially useful that are coming out of the research world.
Cool. So in terms of code, are you kind of building the actual voice AI or kind of tech in the back end, what is going to be working, or is that kind of right to assume?
Yeah, so I mean, our technology stack is a combination of infrastructure, in a way, sort of like traditional back-end systems, but kind of high performance at that, and also machine learning model, serving and inference. So all of those pieces matter. The code that kind of runs the engine has to be very high performance. It has to, in order to have really low latency. And that kind of spans, as soon as the packets hit the server, all the way to whatever models we're inferencing. We run probably five to maybe 7 different kind of machine learning models as part of the stack. And so we do a lot of optimization, low level C++, CUDA kind of kernel optimization to make sure things are running fast and can run concurrently.
Just out of curiosity, because I obviously am nowhere near as experienced in terms of the, I look at it from the platform perspective. I guess I would say you're one below me in terms of you're the people working behind it, and you're involved in that a lot. Mm-hmm. So for like machine learning models, because I always thought it was just, you know, those three kind of LLMs, or sorry, those three types of AI models. You know, you've got text to speech, speech to text, and the LLM, as well as, you know, potentially some maybe machine learning for interruption handling. I assume that was all to do with voice activity. So like, you know, tell me a little more. Like, obviously don't tell me the secrets, like, as much as you can, but like roughly, you know, what are those machine learning models doing in order to kind of get those seamless voice AI interactions?
Yeah, there are a lot of very subtle problems that are easy to overlook, particularly if you are kind of outsourcing all of them. For example, where we've done most of the work so far is on kind of the input side. So, you know, what happens between when raw audio chunks come in through a phone line or a web browser or whatever, and hit the surface. You know, what happens between there and when the information actually goes into the large kind of intelligent model. And you know, you have to understand, of course, what is being said, and there are all sorts of approaches to this, including kind of, you know, fused models and end-to-end models and everything. Uh, we don't do that currently, and I'm a little bit of a contrarian on this point, that I sort of think that for various reasons, the sort of end-to-end omnimodal models are a little bit kind of, I mean, they're magic. Don't get me wrong; they're incredible, and they can absolutely do things that pipelined approaches probably can't reasonably be expected to do, maybe ever. At the same time, I think the differences between those experiences are actually going to be way, way more subtle than people tend to give them sort of
So
credit for.
yeah, just so I understand, like, what do you mean by the difference? Is omni-model, like, what are you saying by that? Just because honestly, I don't know the terminology myself, so I'm assuming others
Okay,
might
yeah.
either.
So GPT 4.0 that you've probably played with or seen, is, according to OpenAI, a omnimodal model, which means that it natively accepts more or less raw audio as input and can generate more or less raw audio as output, without this sort of intermediate step of turning the audio into text and turning the text back into audio. And so, you know, theoretically, it makes a lot of sense that a model that works that way, that doesn't kind of, you know, compress the information dramatically from audio to text and back, it can represent the information in much richer ways, than you can with text. I mean, that step from audio to text and text to audio is extremely lossy in terms of information. And so you get certain abilities, at least in theory, you will get certain abilities that will be very, very hard to, if not impossible, to reproduce by kind of bringing the representation into text and then moving it back from text to audio. But that said, you know, one thing we've seen is, the big companies like OpenAI and Google seem to be extremely sort of conservative when it comes to what they will allow those large omnimodal models to kind of pick up on or talk about in terms of the inputs. So if you ask, you know, GPT 4.0, does my voice sound masculine or feminine? You know, do you think I'm a man or a woman? Which is, to most people, this would be like one of the most basic questions, that, you know, when people answer the phone, oftentimes they'll say yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, or something like that. And those models will refuse to answer that kind of a question. And so even though, you know, inherent to this ability, the sort of fully fused model, it could trivially pick up on those kinds of details. They've sort of neutered that capability anyway. So, you know, if it's sufficiently neutered, then, you know, does it really even matter if it has the capability? And furthermore, it's definitely the kind of capability you could sort of build into a separate model that is represented as text. And so anyway, there are, those kinds of models are extraordinary. They're incredible, no doubt about it. But also, I think there's a lot more leverage to get out of, to be gotten out of sort of like the intermediate text representation approach. And we have some kind of internal experiments going on that are like clearly demonstrating that you can get so much closer to the sort of omnimodal, GPT-4o experience by chaining intelligently kind of smaller models, and you get other benefits. But to answer your question about what are the models that we run currently today, the main sort of, I guess, class of things is around conversational mechanics. That includes transcription, but is a lot more than that. And sort of the easiest way I could explain it is a voice AI should speak as quickly as possible when it's its turn to speak, and when it's not its turn, it shouldn't speak. And that sounds kind of trite, but it's actually a really hard problem. And um, the problem is, it's hard enough to get the latency really, really low in these systems. And there's a little bit of a meme that's kind of bullshit about 200 milliseconds. Like, for some reason, sort of the community like latched onto this meme idea that like AI should respond in 200 milliseconds. I mean, first off, like, it's based on some study that kind of measured humans talking to each other. And like, the reality is that the amount of time people take to reply to other people in conversation is hugely variable. And if you take a really naive approach to it, which is just voice or no voice, and you do sort of a timer, like, the voice stopped 200 milliseconds ago. I guess it's time to talk now. I mean,
You lose that, like,
you're not interrupting me. You just waited,
yeah,
5 seconds?
there we go,
And so, if a thing that reacts in 200 milliseconds, no matter what is coming out of your mouth, is very, very quickly intolerable to speak with.
Much more nuanced, I guess, the way to
And
put it.
so, how do you wait for like, 8 seconds, but then also reply in 200 milliseconds when appropriate? And that is actually like a really non-trivial kind of machine learning problem. And you have to make you have to make the decision itself in like, tens to hundreds, maybe 100 milliseconds. And beyond that, in sort of chat systems generally, RAG, retrieval augmented generation, has become sort of like a go-to tool. It's like one of the fundamental components of chat-based systems. And we often meet customers who have built a text-based chat system with RAG built in. And when we ask them how they've implemented the RAG system, they're using some third-party tool. I won't name any names, but like, there are popular third-party kind of vector database providers that, even with a very, very small vector store, will take like 1 full second to run a retrieval. And if you're doing real-time speech, like, you don't have anywhere near 1 full second to run a retrieval, but in between when someone finishes speaking and when the AI needs to respond. And so, so we run sort of those models on the same cards that we run transcription and endpointing and turn taking and interruption handling and these other things.
Yeah, got it. So it's basically just like, it's just not as simple as, transcribing audio into text. There's a lot more you need to do in terms of like, I guess it's called conversational mechanics of, how exactly does that all work? Like, if you were to just give me like a really brief answer of like, because I'm assuming you're going to be way more qualified in explaining roughly how like the omni-modal stuff works. Like, because this makes more sense to me logically, because it's quite linear. Like, you go from audio back to audio, but there's a lot of steps in between. Is there like omni-modal stuff just like trained on audio and then trained on like what it should output? Is that roughly how it looks?
Yeah, I mean, in the same way that they dump in order to train the sort of text-to-text models, you just dump enormous amounts of text into it, and then you fine-tune it, to do instruction following or chat. They do the same thing roughly, but with audio. And there are all sorts of papers coming out now, like thank God for Meta, and even as funny as it is to be saying, thank God for like Chinese labs like Alibaba, who are publishing a lot of their experiments and a lot of the research. So there are all sorts of approaches to kind of getting the pre-existing sort of text-based model to speak or to hear. But roughly at some point, part of that training is they're just trained on an enormous amount of audio data in the same way that they're trained on an enormous amount of text data. And there are drawbacks to it along a few dimensions. Probably the most important one for people actually working in voice AI appears to be just the costs associated with it. So audio, like a rich, audio file is enormous compared to text. And so, I mean, that's my best explanation for why the OpenAI real-time API is as expensive as it is, because they are actually passing in, the past audios of every turn in the conversation.
Of course, because it's not conversation history. It's okay.
Yeah, it's not conversation history as text. Well, I think it is. It's actually both. So in the same way that with a text, sort of a chat-tuned text LLM, you pass in the whole history of all the text on every turn of the conversation. They do the same thing with the omnimodal model, but you're passing in these like relative to text enormous audio files on each turn, and as far as I can tell, that's why the cost is just huge. Like so we've been implementing the real-time API because some people want access to it, and within 5 minutes, and this is without changing the system prompt, which, as you may know, something we're building a lot of tooling around the ability to kind of dynamically change the system prompt, because that is, as far as we can tell, that is like absolutely the way to get the best kind of performance out of your agents. The downside of that is you can't do prompt caching, and with prompt caching, so in other words, without the ability to dynamically change your prompts, OpenAI's real-time API still within about 5 minutes of conversation, it's like well over $1 a minute, and the longer the conversation goes on, the more expensive it gets by a lot, to the point where like a 30-minute conversation is probably going to cost like maybe $100. I don't know exactly, but it's like enormously expensive.
Yeah, because it is that exponential due to those like past conversational messages.
It's just a huge amount of data that has to get loaded up into the model. And
does that, just out of your, like, I mean, again, I'm asking you on a topic which we'll move on quickly, but like, this isn't what you specify in, it's more that pipeline approach. But is that like, when, I'm guessing it's probably the same in the pipeline, where once you have a decently large conversation, let's say we're 10 minutes in, does that like start affecting latency at all, or not really?
Yeah, it does. It affects latency. It affects cost. I think like something that's sort of maybe underappreciated by. Yeah, I'm completely addicted to X, Twitter, and you get a lot of people on there who have very strong opinions about kind of like where technology is headed and why and all these things. And like one of the sort of common themes on there is like this belief that omnimodal models are definitely the future, and definitely are going to obviate sort of pipelined or cascaded approaches like overnight. There's like one sense in which it's definitely true on a long enough time horizon, but when you're actually kind of like working in the weeds on this stuff and working with customers to get agents to like do a task reliably, like represent their business or represent the character that they're trying to represent or something. Like you have to be so conscientious about, you know, every token that you pass into the model. You have to be looking for these like ways of, you know, compressing the system prompt, or like you're constantly changing the system prompt. You're constantly condensing and compressing the conversation, um, and looking for these sort of efficiencies, both for latency and cost reasons, and for sort of reliability and steerability reasons. And the although the omnimodal models are like really magical for kind of pure, maybe like pure entertainment or sort of pure like conversation for its own sake. You know, I think for one thing, given the API pricing, OpenAI is absolutely subsidizing the ChatGPT voice mode just like to an enormous extent. They are losing money hand over fist on it. And beyond that, you know, it's not like taking that and adapting it for kind of like a production use case for a business where it might be having to handle like a large volume of conversations and like follow like pretty deep and complex scripting. It's a completely different sort of proposition, and like, you know, costs aside, although you really can't put costs aside, and that's one of the major issues. It's like as soon as where, you know, where the real money is at is where you're having conversations at scale, and the pricing just like doesn't even come close to working out, at least for now, with those models. But yeah, I mean, I could go on about that.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so I'll move us on then. I kind of wanted to, yeah, like I said earlier, I want to ask some like kind of more build specific questions, like just maybe, you know, you're not doing this as much as other members in your team, but I'm sure, you know, you're in direct communication anyway. So like, I wanted to kind of know what was your like biggest project in terms of like scale. So maybe concurrency or just like how many calls is being handling by these, you know, multiple agents, and yeah, roughly what that looks like.
Unfortunately, sort of the bigger and more interesting our projects get, the more we tend to be under NDAs. And so I can't name any, but actually, funny enough, probably the highest concurrency we dealt with, in, at least like in a short burst at one point, was actually probably one of the viral demos that we put up on the internet like a while ago. We had this AI pitch deck that just sort of pitches for us, and interestingly enough, we potentially have a customer who we've actually had a lot of people who just literally asked us, "Can I buy a AI pitch deck from you?" Like, we saw that pitch deck. We basically want exactly the same thing, but for our pitch deck, and we never like packaged that up and sold it as a service, but it's completely something you can build on the platform. But that one of those demos, I think the pitch deck went viral. We also had another one that was sort of like a Windows XP, and one of those had like thousands of conversations within like a few, maybe like a 20 or 30 minute period, and it completely knocked over like all of our infrastructure at the time. That was about a year ago. That was before I brought on our current head of infrastructure, and before we had made all sorts of changes to the back end. So it was like totally unequipped to handle that load, and just, you know, the latency shot through the roof, and then like no one could have any conversations, and it was just like totally, you know, chugging along, and kind of awful, but also like pretty entertaining.
yeah, fair enough. Cool. What else did I want to ask you? So I also just like kind of wanted to ask, obviously, you know, the pipeline approach is better, I think, in my just experience as well, as like being able to make it more accurate. Kind of each model has its own separate role, and because of that, it feels like it's more reliable and more, you know, you can kind of load the LLM with a lot more information than if you were to load the, you know, real-time API with a bunch of information. It's starting to struggle because it's not, you know, it's not as specified for dealing with instructions, and because it's, you know, it's focusing on that audio in, audio out. So I just wanted to know, like, how are you kind of ensuring accuracy, reliability with these kind of big enterprise customers? I'm assuming they, you know, that those words are extremely important to them. So yeah, how are you going about doing that?
Yeah, I've sort of been using this term. I don't know if anybody else is using it, which is reprompting. I'm sure other people have a different word for this, and it probably in some cases this is what people are referring to when they say, you know, agents. Um, but to me, what I mean by reprompting is, you know, it became pretty clear. It became pretty clear at some point that the more information that you sort of dump into the system prompt of an LLM, the less reliable it is at instruction following, and that makes perfect sense intuitively. People are the same way. And so we started playing around with like, well, what if you only passed in, you know, the most relevant instruction for the current moment in the conversation at a given time? And, you know, lo and behold, not only do you save enormously on token costs and you get the latency benefits, but you also get much better instruction following, and therefore reliability, basically. And so right now we're going to you may hear some clicking and clacking in the background,
Yes.
and that is one of our extremely intelligent lead engineers working on sort of a drag and drop system for, you know, essentially taking everything we've learned about like this sort of reprompting approach, and building sort of a visual interface to make it way easier to work with. And so the basic principle is kind of like, you know, using a concept of internal state within the agent that it can update on its own, using, you know, tool calling, or we call it actions, to essentially reprompt itself during the conversation. So like the simplest example of that is, you know, when a conversation starts, you want to collect the person's first name, and you don't want to move on to the next stage in the conversation until you have their name. So instead of dumping an entire system prompt that says first get their name, then get their address, then get their this, and then do this, and then if this, then do this, that, all that stuff is unnecessary, and it's just going to reduce the reliability of the agent, because like you're still saying do this other thing next and do this other thing next, and you know, the model is just not smart enough, and they probably aren't going to be smart enough at any time, maybe ever, at least this with these autoaggressive language models, to sort of like ignore all the things that you're dumping in. And so instead of dumping all those instructions, you want to sort of create this like loop where, you know, you have an initial instruction. It's the only instruction that's getting rendered to the agent, other than very high level instructions. That's collect their name, period. Nothing else. Just focus on collecting their name. And then you have an action associated with that, which when you get their name, it updates some internal state, and then that in turn updates the prompt to, you know, tell it to do the next thing, and exposes a new action, and that kind of a thing. So that plus sort of like, you know, good RAG, and those things are sort of, the way that we're building it is those things will be sort of related to each other. So you can have sort of conditionally rendered RAG entries, in addition to kind of like globally rendered RAG entries. Those are all, I would say, sort of like the major, that's like the big thing about getting reliability, I would say.
Yeah, so when you're telling me like these things, you know, when it becomes kind of more complicated in terms of, you know, you're not just sticking in a system prompt with a bunch of instructions. I think most people can write a role, then, you know, all the different things that they want the agent to do, and then chuck in Q&A PDF into a RAG system.
Right.
You know, I think that's a very easy and oversimplified way of kind of deploying these things. So do you think actually in the future, potentially, you know, developers and people who are working on this technology is going to be more important, because, you know, we're going to learn how to use the technology better and make it more reliable, make it faster, make it this, that, where knowing those domain specific and developer kind of things will be more important, or do you think companies like yourself, will do as much as they can to make it as simple as possible for anyone to build, those highly reliable and accurate agents?
Yeah, I mean, self-service is always kind of the dream for a software company, or at least, like a SaaS kind of web product like we have. And we didn't originally build it that way, and we continue to build it as sort of an aspirational self-service platform. And as you mentioned in one of the videos, or the video that you mentioned us in, we at the time had an even longer way to go before we could really be self-service. We've made a lot of improvements since then. We have like new docs that seem to actually be somewhat helpful for people, and we have a new UI and everything, but there's still like a long way to go. And this, drag and drop editor that I mentioned it's going to be, I think, like fairly game changing. Although it is going to be very, very technical, like no doubt about it, it's not going to be for everyone. It's going to be for kind of like hardcore, voice AI developers, basically. And one of the reasons for that is, well, let me answer. I'll get back to that, and I'll sort of say something else about your question. Well, something we noticed when we initially deployed the kind of really shitty version of the self-service platform is, like, aside from the fact that we didn't do our users any favors by having like a easy to use interface, we did see a lot of this, like people just dump a huge system prompt, like 3,000, 5,000 tokens of like just prompting with all these instructions. If they say that, then say this, otherwise do this other thing. And it's just a big static block of text. And we would hear from people who, even when they did work through all of the sort of the difficulties that are just specific to how crappy our platform was, they still weren't getting reliable agents. And they would sort of blame us, and they'd say like, oh, well, why isn't my agent like behaving well? And this is sort of before we had really built any external tooling for this like reprompting thing, which we have now. So if you go in the web platform, you'll see around the system prompt, I think either above or below it, we sort of have these like conditional statements like if and unless, and it sort of gives you access to all the Boolean logic that you might want in order to kind of like programmatically render different prompt elements. It's still not easy to use. You have to like move between that view and the actions view and make sure that they kind of line up, and it's still like a little bit of a mess, admittedly. But before we had that, and even still now that we have it, most people don't seem to kind of like grok that dumping like 3,000 to 5,000 or even more tokens of instructions is like a recipe for like, I mean, it's a recipe for failure in so many ways. Like you're going to pay so much more than you have to. You're going to get so much lower reliability than you would otherwise. You're going to get much higher latency than you would otherwise. Like there's like nothing good about it other than that you can be super lazy. And so yeah, to your question, it's like, I hope we can build a self-service platform that makes it easy enough for people to build the truly kind of agentic, intelligently designed, agents that are reliable by themselves. And, there's a lot of like education and onboarding and all sorts of things that are hard to do when you're not, sort of like venture funded, which we aren't. The other thing that makes the way that we're building this drag and drop thing sort of challenging is like, there are some other companies in the space that have made pretty strong, like very opinionated decisions about what they do with voice AI. So they're like, our customers are people who do appointment scheduling, largely over the phone. And so we're going to build our sort of like visual editor is going to be like very opinionated, that like asking questions, getting dates, and like doing a handful of things are the sort of core, atomic elements of what our voice AI agents do. And we're sort of taking much more of like a hard mode approach, which is like, yes, you should absolutely be able to do appointment scheduling on our platform. You should also be able to do like basically any arbitrary sort of agent with like whatever kind of prompting approach you want to take. And so, the only way to do that viably is to have kind of like multiple layers of abstraction where like the people who just want a really easy to configure appointment scheduling agent will have sort of an option to do that, and it'll be like a higher level of abstraction. But if you don't want that higher level of abstraction that has these sort of opinions baked in about how things ought to be done, like you shouldn't be forced to use those. And so you should be allowed to like, drill into whatever and create your own opinionated framework of how to do tasks. And so that's why we have sort of like a genius working on it, because I'm not smart enough to implement that, but he is.
Fair enough. Yeah, cool. Good to know. Let's see what else I have here. So, okay, my next question is kind of like, once you have your system prompt and, you or whoever is doing a lot of the implementation for the people you work with, and, you're pretty happy with it, but you still need to do some tests. Like, what are you kind of, like, what are the ways you're doing those kind of high level tests of making sure that these, the instructions are being passed in the right time and it's doing the right things and those types of things? Like, how are you testing your AI voice agents before kind of putting it into proper production?
Yeah, that's a great question. Generally, we're still kind of in the like manual testing era. I know there are some startups that are doing sort of automated voice agent testing as a service. I haven't really chatted or engaged much with them. Not for any great reason other than like, it's already very easy to like stuff my day with like 16 hours of things. I have no trouble doing that as it is. And so adding kind of like that other thing is just something that we don't really seem to have time for. But it's also like, there's no automated testing of humans. Like, and so when you're, a lot of the work, not all of it, but it's particularly when people would want testing, they would want testing for something like a call center use case. Not so much like a companion. I mean, we do have customers who are building more kind of like entertainment oriented companions and coaches and things like that. But like, they don't necessarily care about rigorous testing in those environments. The environments that would, in theory, care about very rigorous automated testing would be sort of the enterprise, like contact center type things. But you have to also understand like what you're being compared against, which is people. And generally the bar is really low in that environment. There's no automated testing of people. I mean, maybe some companies out there kind of like, 1 out of 1,000 calls are actually sort of a manager, like, trying to stump an agent or something. But generally the bar is like really, really low for human agents. It's like, couple days of onboarding and light training, and then, throw the person to the wolves. And, and there are some companies that are working on like automated reporting. They look at the transcripts and they try to understand using, an LLM, they try to predict like, did the customer have a good experience in this interaction? Yes or no? And that kind of a thing. But even that stuff is really early. So generally with our customers who are kind of in that enterprise, and we do these kind of like white glove, enterprise integrations, generally they are, more than happy with sort of like, I called it a bunch of times or I spoke with it a bunch of times in the interface and it seems to work well. And we do a lot of work in that, like in the integration and the implementation to kind of like try to account for edge cases that they might not have considered and try to keep things kind of on rails. But I will mention, one other thing we have in the app currently is after you have a conversation, you can go into the transcripts view, and if you sort of open up a transcript, you can actually step through every turn of the conversation, and you'll see sort of like a GitHub-esque diff view on every turn that tells you exactly how your entire prompt changed from one turn to another. And so because we do this sort of like reprompting thing using internal state, it can be very hard to keep track of like, all right, well, if that state variable updated and then the RAG system, you know, brought in these other RAG entries into the prompt, like these things are constantly changing on every turn of the conversation. And so we've built tooling so that you can step through step by step, like, and see, okay, when it said this is exactly what was rendered to it in the system prompt. And that's been hugely helpful, at least for us internally, for debugging. Like, if we don't know why it said something or it took an action in a place where it probably shouldn't have taken one, we go back, step through, find the point in the conversation, and then usually it's obvious why something happened. And we also have another feature in there where we call it re-roll. So like, and again, we need to work on the UX of this and like make it all a lot tighter than it is right now. But the basic idea is like, something went wrong, you know, 10 turns into the conversation, 20 turns into the conversation. You don't want to have to like go have another conversation and try to get it to say all the same things and have yourself, you know, you say all the same things to get to that same point. Ideally, what you can do is basically like go make a change that you think will solve whatever the issue was that happened at turn 20 in the conversation, and see, you know, what would have been different if the conversation were at that same place after the change that you made to your system prompt or to your RAG or whatever. And so that's what the reroll feature is for, where you know, you can just like highlight the workflow. Basically is you would have another version of the persona, say like dev. We usually create sort of like, you know, Git. We'll have like a main version and a dev version of the same persona. We'll sort of like, you can use another function that we call assigning, or basically cloning the persona to the dev version. Go make the change that you think is going to fix the issue on the dev version, and then find the, you know, problematic point in the conversation in the main version, hit re-roll, use the dev persona to generate the re-roll, and see if, you know, what it says in the re-roll is better or fixes the issue. And if it does, you can just, you know, check it off as like a resolved issue. Cool. So that
sounds very, very useful actually.
It's totally clunky. It's really clunky and it's not intuitive, but it is super useful.
Yeah, that's kind of like the way I look at Sindarin, like, just because obviously, like I said, you're like a step below me, you know. I'm the kind of person that is utilizing this and really trying to learn the platforms. And the way I look at Sindarin is, you guys definitely have the best like tooling, because I think you're doing a lot more implementation than the other platforms out there, i.e. you guys are implementing yourselves, and therefore you're finding out what is useful. Like, oh, this would be useful when we, you know, the agent made a mistake and we want to change the system prompt and re-roll that scenario to see if the new system prompt is getting us a better output. And so I like that. But because you're not VC funded and because you're, you know, less focused on all that stuff, the UI is lacking, which isn't an issue for people like myself, because at the end of the day, we want a good agent on the phone. Like, how we get there, it doesn't matter to the people we're working with. So, I mean, I think that's really useful for the people to know. It's like, you know, if you're looking more for a developer side of things, like, you know, look into Sindarin and just the kind of cool tools they have, because they're obviously deploying a lot more than, you know, like other platforms.
1 second, Hugo.
Yeah, no worries.
Hey, I'm in an interview at the moment. Oh, no worries. Sorry about that.
No worries at all. Yeah, I think it's just like you guys, because you're doing a lot more implementation, you know, you have those tools and tricks that a lot of the other platforms, which are just building what like the developers think they want, compared to what you guys is like from your own experience. So I think that really makes a difference.
It's funny. It's funny you say that. I mean, I sort of can't imagine doing it any other way. Like, obviously, developers will tell you what they need, or at least, like you said, what they think they need or want. But yeah, it's hard to imagine kind of making like the right or the best possible decisions if you're not like at least doing some of them yourself. And so, yeah, I think I can't honestly. I can't speak too much to other platforms because I don't spend any time using them. But it does kind of seem like from what I sort of like, and if nothing else, the vibes from customers and potential customers, it does seem like we do an exceptional job at sort of like challenging, complicated, like very high standards sort of workflows and tasks where we oftentimes when we meet customers, we're not the first sort of like live agent AI company that they've spoken with. And a lot of the time they've even already done a pilot, at least a demo, if not the early stages of a pilot with another company. And they just got hung up at some point where either it was the latency was not tolerable, or the way the voice sounded was not tolerable, or the price wasn't right, or the agent just didn't kind of do the thing it was supposed to do reliably. And that seems to be where we have like a really easy time relatively sort of, appealing to these customers and like getting through those early phases of pilots, I guess because of what you're describing.
Yeah, I genuinely think that's like the difference that I've noticed between like the way I kind of almost look at Sindarin in a completely different bracket of its own, that it's like you guys aren't just like, and I'm not trying to like say like it's a different approach to how you're building the platform. A lot of the other platforms feel like they're just building the voice AI tech, and because they're not doing the implementation, they're losing out on some of those cool use cases that could be there and would be useful. Okay, so I got another question in terms of like more build specific questions, and then I'll ask a few more like Sindarin, and then we'll go on to quickly because I don't want to waste your time. I kind of booked you in for an hour, and by the way, if you need to go, just let me know.
Let me check my calendar real quick just to see,
no
but I think I have some more time. Yeah, I should make sure that's absolutely true. Yeah, I'm good for going over time.
No worries. Okay, just let me know, when you need to go. So like this is kind of a question that obviously I think is a little bit of a zero-sum question because it's not that important, but I think people like knowing the answer to these kind of questions, and it would be what is your like favorite model, like in terms of LLM or like voice model provider, because obviously I think you're doing a lot of the transcription yourself, and I'm assuming you're using maybe some sort of model as well as some on top of stuff, but like what would you say are your favorite models?
This is such an easy question. Llama 3 70B 3.1 3.3 whatever, but like for so many reasons. I mean, the easy answer is it's just the right mix of speed, intelligence, cost, and then like this sort of more highfalutin answer is like OpenAI literally deprecates their models. Claude's unusable for voice because they have low rate limits and high latency. But basically, I think like if you're building a product that isn't just kind of totally like ephemeral, let people have like a fun conversation here and there, low stakes, like sure, use a model that is going to be deprecated like at any moment with maybe a few months of notice. But if you're trying to build like a reliable agent, for so many reasons you want to do it on top of an open source model. Like for one thing, because it's not going to change and it's not going to go away. Like if worse comes to worse, you host it on your own hardware. And then as long as you have access to that hardware, you have the same agent that you had, years ago. Um, and so you're never sort of liable to like lose the hard work you did of configuring the agent to behave the way that you want it to. And then there's also, I'm seeing sort of a more like immediate practical concern is like OpenAI just had a 4-hour outage a few days ago. And because OpenAI is the only company that can host OpenAI models, I guess Microsoft does too. But because they're the only two, then like if those models become unavailable, you have no alternative and you're screwed. Whereas like, how many companies are there hosting Llama, including, yourself or us, if we need to. And so, yeah, all day I'm like a total llama maximalist.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, I think a lot of like the kind of builders really do and praise Meta a lot for just how they've approached the AI stuff. I genuinely think it's like, you would never expect Mark Zuckerberg to be kind of on the good side, and he's really had a big transformation in the past year. So no, I think a lot of people in the AI space, really like what he's doing there. So that makes a lot of sense. And in terms, actually, to be fair, I wanted to just like kind of what's the word, like explain to and get your explanation as to why it's so important that like when a model gets depreciated into, even if it's the same one, so like 3.5 Sonnet to 3.5 Sonnet V2, why is that an issue? Like if it's the same model-ish, right?
Yeah, I mean, because these things are so unpredictable, and tuning an agent to behave the way that you want it to is sort of like a black art. It's it's not a science. It's not like writing a computer program. Once you write a program, like it behaves the same unless there's some randomness introduced by design. Like it behaves the exact same way every single time, and language models are not like that. At least like in the configuration that makes them interesting and useful, which is having the temperature higher than 0. You don't really know if they're going to sort of like say the wrong thing at the wrong moment or whatever. It's all sort of statistical. So it's like, getting reliability to, 99 and 99.9 and so on percent is like a lot of trial and error and a lot of like testing and retesting, and the slightest change to the underlying model can have these like huge sort of it's like butterfly effect sort of consequences. And so if you spend all this time refining and refining and refining, and testing and testing and testing, and really gaining confidence that like, okay, you've got a good configured agent, like you can't stump it, you can't get it to say something you don't want it to say, like you do not want to touch that thing. You want that thing to remain exactly as it is. And even a model update that supposedly makes one better, I mean, this even does happen with the Llama models. Like as much as I love them, they're like, there's a lot of sort of people sort of assume that because there's a new model with a higher version number, it must be better. But the truth is, like, if you've got an agent working on 3, and now they've released 3.3, like there is non-zero risk to just flipping the switch from 3 to 3.3, even if it's like scoring better on all the benchmarks.
Yeah, it's like it has like a different psyche almost. It can potentially be more intelligent, but now those instructions that worked on 3.0 just for some reason are slightly different for 3.3, and you know, like, you don't want to change those things. So
and there's no real way of knowing how exactly, other than like vibe, and going through that whole process of like testing all over again.
And for voice, like what do you think is the best provider? What has the best latency? What do you find have like the least issues and kind of feels the most natural? Is there something there that's the best or not really?
As much as I sort of like feel conflicted about saying this because they just launched a conversational engine. 11 Labs is definitely the best in terms of not in terms of conversation. Like I will go head to head against them any day, and we wipe the floor with them. Like their latency is really bad.
Yeah. I made a video about it. It's just not there yet, unfortunately. It's a cool like, and I always, and I'm sure you're probably the same. Like, you know, when big companies like that or OpenAI, when they release their real-time API, it's almost not a bad thing, especially where right now, you know, they're all a little bit flawed, and so, you know, it just brings more light and attention to companies and the ones that are doing it right. So I think it probably helps you, in fact, because it's like, you know, it really shows how much better you are in the kind of space of conversational AI.
It is a funny thing to kind of like be, you know, like consuming their voice API and kind of making it look better than they are able to make it look. Like getting more out of that one component than they are getting out of it in their thing that's kind of competing with us.
Literally.
I will say there are. I mean, this is not like private knowledge to me, but like open source is absolutely catching up, and we've been kind of like working on some things internally that we've learned a lot about this just voice, like real-time voice, and how to, you know, what's missing from APIs like 11 Labs, what they do well, where there's room for improvement. You know, like ultimately, the only reason not to do the sort of multimodal, fully fused thing is that like you have to be GPU rich in order to do it. Usually, like with few I mean, there are some approaches using sort of like LoRa's and other things that are kind of interesting, but like to train a model like the GPT-4o model, like you need an enormous amount of compute. You need to spend millions and millions of dollars on training runs, and not to mention, you know, all the other sort of tooling and infrastructure to make it good. And so I have a feeling where we're going to end up is like we're going to have our own voice model internally, and it's going to sort of be built in a way that takes everything we've learned about how to do things and how to make things feel good. And it's actually going to feel almost indistinguishable from an omnimodal end-to-end model. And if we had the resources today, we would have that within like probably 6 to 10 months. We would have something that's like almost for everyone except for like nerds like us who know how to kind of poke and prod these things to like, you know, sort of reverse engineer what's going on internally. For everyone else, they would not be able to tell the difference between, you know, what we would do with a cascaded approach and what an omnimodal model does.
Cool. It kind of like segues to my next question, which is like, what is your plan? And you already answered a few of these things, but like, what is your plan for like the future of Sindarin? Are you looking to, you know, like you said, build your own voice model, or are you, you know, trying to do something else? Are you looking to get VC funded? Because, you know, you've mentioned that a few times, or is that something you're not really bothered about? You know, where is the future for Sindarin?
Yeah, I mean, I think it continues to be, you know, aspirationally a self-service platform. So we'll continue to kind of make the same tools that we use to do these white glove implementations. We just build into the platform, which is publicly available, and so you know, other people will continue to be welcome to kind of like do exactly what we do with these white glove implementations, and hopefully it'll get better and better and easier to use. But you know, really where the money is for us now is these sort of white glove implementations, where we're speaking directly with a customer who, you know, these customers don't know the first thing about like voice AI, or they don't know what an LLM is. Maybe they've heard of ChatGPT, but like they don't know that ChatGPT is a large language model, and they don't know that, you know, Llama 3. they know almost nothing about these sort of internal details whatsoever. And so we're doing these kind of like very hands-on, you know, we like don't worry about any of that stuff. We will just like take you from where you are today, which is you don't have a voice AI on your phones, to where you want to be, which is you do have voice AI on your phones, and it's like doing the thing you want it to do, and it does it reliably, and it does it well, and your customers like it. And in addition to that, we don't only do phone stuff either, and this is one of the challenges we've had with VCs, which is like it looks like a total lack of focus. And to give you an example, like we're wrapping up a fairly deep engagement with a virtual reality company. It's like one of the leading experiences on the Meta headset, and we added these like very sort of interactive characters to the game, and hopefully that'll be like rolling out soon. And to most like VCs and investors, this, and even to me, frankly, sometimes I do wonder about this. Like, it looks like total distraction. It's like, why are you trying to do call center automation on the one hand, and then like video game characters on the other? Those are completely different things. And it looks like a total lack of focus. But for better or for worse, my response to that is like, number one, we do it because it's really fucking cool, and number like 2 through maybe 5 is actually the reason why we have the lowest latency and sort of like the best conversation feel is because we do that kind of stuff. And the reason is that, at least for me and probably for most people working in voice AI, doing stuff on the phone is just boring. Like, it's not that inspiring. Most of us who are millennials or younger like don't use phones all that much, and we don't talk on the phone all that much. And so to sit there building a product where your only feedback loop is picking up a phone and listening to a dial tone for a few seconds and talking to an agent at 8 kilohertz, MU-law format, like it's just not that fun. And the reason why we became obsessed with latency and obsessed with endpointing and obsessed with the turn-taking mechanics was because one of the earliest prototypes we built was in virtual reality, where there's an actual persona with a face and eyes making eye contact with you, and you're speaking with it and it's speaking back to you. And when you have that kind of experience as like a test bed, it's so much more compelling, and you want that latency to get lower by 100 milliseconds, and you want the turn taking to get better, and you want, like, it becomes so obvious that it needs all these improvements, and it's so much more motivating to work on those improvements. And then, and the only reason we ended up doing call center stuff and even phone stuff, frankly, is we built the technology for like games and companions and stuff, and then people from the call center world found us and were like, what are you doing? You have to be in the call center world. But I think like the roots are in these much more engaging
fun
kind
stuff.
of like fully interactive experiences, and so I don't plan on sort of losing that thread, for the sake of like going after call centers.
Fair enough. Okay, so I'm gonna get into like some more, like I guess, like I said, market questions. Like, I want to kind of get your opinions. I mean, maybe you don't know exactly where the market's gonna go, but I wanted to know kind of what you think is gonna look like. So I first wanted to ask you is like, roughly how long do you think? Because I think it's fair to say that right now, like you just said, people don't know what it is, and they don't care too much, but they're starting to want to adopt this technology. And my question is like, how long do you believe it's going to be until the adoption of this technology will be, almost all? Like, let's say websites right now, when do you think this will be for voice AI? Let's say specifically business related and like phone stuff, because obviously maybe video games might be a different kind of market,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the video game thing, you know, definitely the VR thing. Those are much longer time horizon sort of things. I do think they're inevitable. I think it's inevitable we are going to be speaking with AI, you know, characters or personas in virtual reality, even if not augmented reality, like as probably way more than any of us can even like conceive today. Uh, Maybe 10 years down the road or whatever, maybe only 5 or less even. But as far as the phone stuff, I mean, it seems to be happening really quickly. I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of 2025, it's like, I mean, to be honest, I don't know the numbers so well that I'd be comfortable putting a real number out there, but
Yeah, fair enough.
like these things can scale so fast, and once you kind of have the tooling in place, and once you can get through the IT department and all these, there are all these like practical concerns with really deploying them, where like, you know, enterprises have long sales cycles, they have all sorts of impediments and roadblocks, and like, you know, you can't get API keys for months because the IT person, you know, is lazy and doesn't want to give them to you or whatever, and like, so there are a lot of these like just operational things that slow it down, but like
but the intent is there.
yeah,
The
I mean the
intent of
tech is
like
definitely
adoption.
there. It's basically just a matter of like crunching through these kind of operational issues, and like getting the agents configured and getting them working reliably. So it's really, yeah, it's really like the only impediment I think is kind of like just the nature of sales cycles, but not really the technology.
Okay, fair enough. And like from the kind of white glove stuff that you're doing, is there a specific industry or a specific use case that is kind of, you know, most being adopted in terms of business phone agents?
Not really. We actually have a pretty like strikingly diverse set of verticals represented. It's almost as if we have like an equal amount from kind of like multiple major verticals, and
Fair enough.
fortunately, you know, these models are sufficiently intelligent and capable that like it doesn't really matter what vertical they're in. And you know, maybe that's the wrong approach, and maybe we'll pick a vertical, and like who knows. But for the moment, like you know, I like to think I'm pretty thoughtful about what we're seeing, and do we really think it's like feasible to go after kind of this like broad approach. For the moment, it does seem to be that way. Like there haven't been really any huge red flags where we go to some industry or some customer, and like there's some obvious reason why we need to like focus entirely on that one instead of continuing to onboard customers in different industries.
Okay, fair enough. And so, I mean, you kind of briefly mentioned that technology is there, but what are like the current limitations or like the biggest pitfalls, I would say, of this technology? Like, where are we really lacking to get like the most, or like even if we were just to compare it to the Omni model, like how could we get closer to that at obviously higher scale because of that cost difference?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things kind of there are certain edge cases in terms of sort of like low level audio processing. So for, you know, something we've noticed is like when you're in the car on the highway on speaker mode on speakerphone, that's very hard. Like hearing what someone is saying clearly is really hard. That speakerphone in the car driving fast, especially if like the windows are cracked a little bit, that's really hard. Yeah, and there are some other things like disambiguating multiple people speaking. Like these are all kind of like solved problems. There are solutions to these throughout, and there have been for years. But sort of like, and one of the promises of omnimodal models is like, in theory, they just will learn whose voice to focus on, and they'll learn, you know, what someone, you know, how to like focus on someone's voice even if they're in a car on speakerphone and so on. GPT-4o doesn't seem to have done that so far anyway. Like it, as far as I know, it doesn't kind of naturally like tell one voice from another. It does sort of mishear somewhat regularly. I actually wouldn't be surprised if our ability to sort of hear correctly is maybe a little bit more accurate than the omnimodal model, because we've like put a lot of work into that. But obviously they have too. It would be interesting to see a head-to-head comparison. But yeah, there are these things at the margins. Like if you've got a lot of people talking, if there's music playing in the background, and sometimes it thinks that the singer is someone trying to speak, and like things like that, they can be overcome. But they're not, at least on our platform, like they sometimes, if there's loud music playing, it does have a hard time, realizing that it's its turn to respond, and it shouldn't just be listening to the music. I'm not sure anyone else has cracked that like all that much more than we have.
Yeah, I was having issues with that. I was testing one of the AI agents or AI voice agents over the phone, and I'd like to work at a cafe just because it's, and it was just really struggling to stop listening. It just kept listening because other people were talking in the background.
Yeah.
And so, it's those kind of things. I think you're right. It's those small little tweaks that need to be fixed and kind of more reliable in terms of, it being correct all the time. And so, fair enough. But there's no major kind of limitations that...
I don't think so. I mean, like, generally what we see is kind of what's available today seems to be, even for pretty difficult customers who have pretty high standards, they seem to be happy with where it is. And those kinds of edge cases, by definition, they don't come up all that often. And so when you weigh the frequency of the catastrophe of those, or the magnitude, let's say, of those edge cases against the benefits of having these agents, like generally the sort of trade-offs do seem to be in favor of like deploying them, even with those edge cases, knowing about them, knowing they're going to happen sometimes.
Okay, fair enough. That's all my questions. So we've rattled through them a bit late, but hopefully, that's it from me. Have you got any like questions that you think could potentially be useful for the video, or do you want to mention something?
No particular questions, but well, I mean, I guess one question would be sort of from your perspective as a sort of like a voice AI developer, what could we do to make it easier for you, make your experience better? How can we help?
I think something I'm seeing a lot is that, especially when I work with kind of slightly bigger clients, more enterprise clients, and this is just like, I'm sure you guys probably already have this tooling, but they quite often send me call recordings and they're like, this is what I want. Yeah. And so I kind of wish like you could chuck in 20, 30, 50 even call recordings, and then somehow, with some sort of sentiment analysis, get a rough conversational flow or a rough system prompt. And that kind of gives us like that first basis, and then obviously we do a lot of tweaking. And I've built some internal tooling to get a little bit of that for myself. Mm-hmm. But I think, if a platform could do that reliably, it would obviously be quite useful, and probably be useful to kind of just like cut me out, in the sense that if they have cool recordings, they can just chuck it on and get, a reliable agent-ish.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, I mean, reducing the friction to getting a reliable agent overall is obviously sort of like the holy grail. That's a great idea. We probably won't implement that soon, but eventually, maybe.
Yeah, it's just something that, it's always easy-ish for the client to be like, this is roughly what I want, because I have recordings, and so it's just something that I deal with a lot. It's like just listening over recordings or reading the transcripts and being like, okay, I understand the conversational flow now. Let me translate this to a rough prompt and a rough kind of workflow within the platforms themselves. But other than that, I think, I mean, I haven't actually looked at I haven't seen that, what did you call it, reroll thing. I've never used that because I'm not building a lot in Sindarin. I don't really, I'm building more in other platforms, but it's the only reason why I don't build in Sindarin, which is not even your own fault. It's just like concurrency. It's 7. And when I always look at like bigger platforms, it's just always more like what's the word? More like tempting to build in those, just because it's like I know it's easier for my clients and easier for me. But the actual, like, what I do quite often is that I chuck in what I've done on another platform and just chuck it into Sindarin, and it's just always better. Like, which just like kind of speaks to how good the back end is you guys have just better technology in terms of, you know, having good conversational AI. But that's like the only difference for me.
The concurrency issue is about to change dramatically.
Really? Cool.
I mean, one of the challenges to running a bunch of models that we trained ourselves is like we also have to deploy and scale them and like, you know, do all these optimizations for high concurrency. And we finally made a really significant breakthrough on exactly that. And so expect the sort of like concurrency limits to change dramatically.
Yeah, that would be amazing, because it's really the only difference. And I also understand, because obviously you are a smaller platform in terms of how many calls you're probably handling. Just compare it to like Vapi, I guess we can throw that name out there. I'm sure they are handling more calls because it's a bigger, more well-known platform, and because of that, I'm guessing they've already had to deal with fixing those scale issues compared to you guys, which haven't. But the voice AI, like, I don't want to shit on Vapi too much, but I will chuck in a system prompt that works on any other platform, and it has the same, and I'm using the same models, and Vapi just struggles for some reason. So the actual voice AI tech is just lacking there, but it has, you know, and some platforms are a little bit better, but they have that concurrency, which makes a big difference to me, because I don't like worrying about that, you know, in case now I can't, you know, the agents can't handle calls. And
what is a concurrency? And maybe it's the answer is just, you know, what do they have on their platforms? But what is sort of an amount of concurrency that makes you feel comfortable and confident? Yeah.
I think for me, I just like, especially when I'm starting to work with bigger people, it would always just be 20. I think 20.
Okay.
Yeah, I think because you'll never really go over 20 unless obviously it's huge scale. And something that I like about retail AI, which, you know, I mentioned to you before, and it's quite often I do a lot of the work I do on that platform, is that I can just press add onto my billing, and I pay $8 extra a month for extra concurrency, which is very cheap. And like, you know, I'm maybe, and I haven't tested this myself, and it might be, you know, something that you can tell me just from technical side of things, that, you know, even if I were to buy those extra concurrency, even though it is concurrent, maybe the latency gets worse on those extra 40, you know, that might be the case, but it's more just like a feeling thing rather than more practical maybe. But yeah, I think 20 is where I kind of feel comfortable for, you know, bigger stuff.
Cool. We can do that.
Cool. Yeah, good to hear. So yeah, but other than that, I mean, actually I have one question for you. Like, maybe actually it's better, yeah, like if you were to, like, from your experience as the person who is, you know, doing this like pipeline stuff and actually building the core technology, like, what do you have for like people like me and voice AI developers, like tips on how to build, you know, more production ready voice AI agents that, you know, because of your experience, you know, compared to like us? Because I think what I'll say is that a lot of people just do the prompt, tool, and knowledge base, right? And, you know, there's only so far you can go with that, and a lot of the platforms only allow that. And with custom LLMs, you can start doing a lot of what you have in terms of like, you have scenarios, and, you know, from reading the documentation, the top 5 most kind of contextually relevant things get passed into the system prompt, and so a lot of that you could build yourself on those other platforms. But like, yeah, what would you recommend, or like think a good tip for us would be?
I mean, this is obviously a completely self-serving answer, but I sincerely believe that anyone who, you know, wants to do exactly what you're saying, build, you know, reliable, scalable, performant agents, if with enough time and enough effort and, you know, careful thought and everything, they would basically end up, you know, re-implementing what we're already building. And so, you know, my kind of like sincere but maybe annoying answer is, particularly when we have this new kind of interface that I mentioned up, it would be like, use that.
Fair enough.
Like I don't know of a better way to do it other than the way that we're doing it, and obviously it's like full of like again, like we haven't had or spent the resources to like educate and train and provide like guidance and onboarding to the extent that would be really helpful, but like we literally we're doing these implementations regularly, and as we're doing it, we're adding features to both the core engine and the front end that are like the highest priority features that we ourselves need to do these implementations. So like almost every feature in there, I mean, literally like the way that we've built the platform is we have some customer, whether they're a developer like you or whether they're not, and we're doing kind of the implementation. One way or the other, like someone tries to accomplish something and they can't do it, and we think about why for a few minutes and then come up with a solution and implement it pretty quickly, and we just keep doing that, and like that's how we've gotten to where we are now, and that's how we will get to this kind of new interface I've been hyping up so much. And so like I don't have any tips other than like everything we do is inspired by what we learn here.
Yeah, I think that's again why I do really particularly like Sindarin for the voice AI tech, like and obviously I'm sure you can understand yourself that that concurrency stuff and the UI and they're all slight little differences that do matter, and I think you're aware of that, which makes sense for yourself. But I think that's a very fair thing to say, even though obviously it can sound a little bit like annoying. But yeah, I think it's just like the way you guys are going about voice AI is just better for getting more reliable, low latency, and just all of that kind of stuff. It is an improvement. And like I said, when I just copy and paste things, literally just don't even change anything, and sometimes don't even adapt them because I know you guys have that if, unless, or and all of that kind of stuff. Even if I don't adapt it, it's still better. So that kind of just proves the voice AI fundamentals is better. So but yeah, that's it. So thank you, Brian, for the conversation. It was actually really nice because we've only talked in more random stuff, and getting to know your opinions. I think generally you are like from the reading I've done on your Twitter or your LinkedIn, like one of the more kind of bright minds in voice AI, and I'm sure your developers are even more bright, I guess, from what you said. But I think because I'm quite new into this space, and I'm more of like I post more on social media, and I'm a little less in the research labs. I mean not research labs, research papers, and I'm more like just implementing, and I'm more of that young kid who just wants to make money with this crap. But like listening to people that actually have been working on this stuff for years is really interesting, and definitely is useful for me and other people to know that kind of stuff that you're from your experience. So thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. And I think you're underselling yourself a little bit. I'm extremely impressed with what you do and your YouTube channel and your general attitude and sort of like disposition about everything. So great job to you.
Thank you. Well, great job to you too. So I'm glad we both agree on that.